We're back. We're gonna get started here. I think we have another treat, a conversation that's going to be moderated by Paul Singer, who's the Washington correspondent for USA Today, and also a class of 1988 here from Kenyon. And so, Paul, I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks very much. Appreciate it, Tom. Thanks all for having us here. I'll just correct him and say I'm 88.5. And it is my pleasure to be here to interview Nadine Strossen. You can look her up in the book, but she is a constitutional law professor at New York Law School. She's the immediate past president of the ACLU, so you may have heard of some of that. Most importantly, she's the author of the forthcoming book, Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. So I'd like to start the conversation by asking you, because I'm a reporter, I'm the only guy in here who's not actually learned. What is hate?
Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, notice that I'm wearing the Kenyon color.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And you really zinged in on one of the most problematic aspects of trying to censor hate speech, because what is hate? It is an emotion. By definition, it is subjective, and one person's hate is somebody else's love. Therefore, one person's hate speech is somebody else's beloved speech, and we see so many examples of this. One, and that actually leads to censorship in the many countries that, including other democratic countries, that make it a crime to engage in hate speech. So there's a big cultural conflict, including in this country, between certain religious values and certain prevailing secular values. Many cultural and religious conservatives consider homosexuality to be a sin. That's true in both Christianity and Islam. So when you have imams or preachers talking about the sin of homosexuality, that is often seen and occasionally punished in Europe as hate speech against the LGBT community. And yet to call that out as hate speech is then in turn seen and sometimes punished as Islamophobia or hate speech against Muslims or anti-Christian hate speech.
Well, and when I was a student here, I hated the DeFis, right? But would I, you know, and as the editor of the newspaper, I made that pretty clear. But did I have a right to say that? Should I have a right to say that? Either I hate the DeFis or I hate the Jews. Is there a difference?
So I think one of the most famous statements that well encapsulates the American tradition of free speech comes from Oliver Wendell Holmes, Supreme Court Justice, when he talked about freedom of speech protects the speech and the idea that we loathe. He used the word loathe, but obviously it means hate. You have a right to say things that are hateful and that are hated. This is a point that Greg Lukianoff made in the last panel, that and the Supreme Court has called it the bedrock principle of our free speech jurisprudence, that government may never censor speech merely because the government or the community, even the vast majority of the community, despises the idea, no matter how deeply they despise the idea. And we call that viewpoint neutrality. So the mere fact that an idea is hated or offended or considered to be evil or dangerous is never enough to justify censoring it. I do agree with the other point that Greg made, and it's something that became much more clear to me as a result of doing the research and writing the book, that American law is much more nuanced than it is usually given credit for. So we will often hear statements diametrically opposite and yet equally erroneous. Number one, free speech is not hate speech. That statement was made by Howard Dean, the former governor of Vermont, chair of the Democratic National Committee, in the context of Ann Coulter being not allowed to speak at Berkeley. He said, oh, but hate speech is not free speech. And then a few weeks later, Ted Wheeler, the mayor of Portland, used exactly the same mistaken, erroneous statement in explaining why he was trying to shut down a planned rally in that community of groups that he called alt-right. That is not true. The mere fact that the message is hateful, that it conveys hatred, that it is hated, none of that is a justification for censoring it. But the opposite is also not true. So when people say hate speech is protected, also not true. In certain contexts, speech with any message, including a hateful message, may be censored if, but only if, necessary to prevent a serious danger of imminent adverse conduct or consequences.
Okay, but all those adverbs make this hard.
Right? It is. It's a very tough test.
Where, when I stand up in front of the, Robert E. Lee Memorial and shout that this is my heritage and this is my culture, that's a free speech, right? But if I'm carrying a gun, does that change when does the government have the right to say, you have gone beyond being just a jerk and now you're actually dangerous?
Yeah, it is very much a difficult test to satisfy. So it's in relatively rare circumstances that that test is met. And yet, when you look at incidents that are cited by people who say, oh, we should move more in the European direction, we should allow more hate speech to be censored. Actually, the examples they give are already subject to censorship in the United States. But before I give you some of those examples, let me respond to your exact question, which is what about the presence of firearms? So this test is, and I summarize it by calling it the emergency test. Is there an actual danger or imminent danger of serious adverse consequences? And that depends on the context, right? All of the facts and circumstances. Certainly, the presence of firearms is a very relevant fact and circumstance that would lead to a particular type of harm that is one of the categories in which speech, including hate speech, may be punished now. And that is if it constitutes what the courts call a genuine threat. Not a threat in the loose way that we hear that term used. Oh, I feel threatened or I feel unsafe. And I don't mean to mock those feelings. I know they're genuine. But to constitute a genuine threat that will justify suppression or punishment of the speech, the speaker has to mean to instill a reasonable fear of being subject to immediate violence. And by a reasonable fear, that means not subjective. Would a reasonable person in your position feel that fear? Now, the ACLU is criticized from both sides, which I usually take as a sign that we're probably doing pretty well at nonpartisanly defending freedom, all fundamental freedoms, including freedom of speech for everyone. So we were criticized a lot for defending successfully the right of the alt-right groups to demonstrate where they had been given permits to demonstrate. We persuaded the judge that there was no imminent danger of serious violence that could not be averted through police protection. So, right, even the emergency principle is not satisfied until you've exhausted all other alternatives. Suppressing the speech.
I'm sorry, to make sure I understand that. What you're saying is that assuming providing police presence would have diffused the possibility of violence, then the speech should carry on.
Exactly.
It was only if the presence of police was not enough to diffuse.
Enough.
Okay.
So suppressing the speech is always the last resort if nothing else suffices. And the usual other alternatives are police protection or in some other situations, counter speech, trying to dissuade or rebut the arguments that are being made. So the ACLU was criticized for successfully arguing that the speech should be allowed to go forward. After the violence occurred in Charlottesville, Anthony Romero, the executive director of the ACLU, was being interviewed by skillful journalists such as yourself for another publication. And the journalist elicited from Anthony a statement that he said off the top of his head, but I actually agree with, which is that in the future, the ACLU is going to think much more carefully, at least, and perhaps even adopt a bright line rule against defending freedom of speech for assemblies where firearms are being brandished. And I was told about that during a podcast interview, so I was kind of hit with it over the head by another skillful reporter. And my reaction then is the same reaction I have after thinking about it, which is just putting myself in the position of trying to convey my free speech rights and my ideas to people who are standing there, not just with their mouths and their placards, but with guns, would definitely exercise a chilling effect on my free speech rights. It would be intimidating. So I think that would satisfy the standard of a genuine threat.
It's interesting because you guys, the ACLU, will also defend someone's right to carry a gun. That's another one of the rights.
Everything has to be considered in context, and just as the First Amendment is not an absolute, it has an emergency exception, the same would certainly be true of the Second Amendment, which is in itself written in less absolute terms.
Well, let me ask a little bit about counter speech, because I know this is something that in your book, and it's something you talk about, is that if we can't not hear it, if we can't shut it down, then we need to respond to it. This is what you call counter speech, right?
And it's not my idea from the great Supreme Court opinions at the beginning of the 20th century that talked about the fact that it's not enough that we disagree with speech and think that it might ultimately lead to some negative result is not a justification for censoring it. The remedy for evil counsels is good ones, said Justice Louis Brandeis. And to understand the importance of this narrow emergency exception, we have to think about what was the alternative. The alternative before the Supreme Court adopted this standard was called the bad tendency test. So if speech had a tendency to instill a certain idea that might in the long run lead to some negative conduct, that alone was enough to justify censorship. So that's why socialists and communists and anti-war demonstrators and pro-contraception demonstrators at a time when contraception was a crime, all of those were punished because their speech might lead to some bad consequence far down the line, including breaking the law.
But so is it my obligation, if I am opposed to these views, to stand across the street from them and yell?
So first of all, there is certainly no legal duty to engage in counter speech. I believe very strongly, though, that there is a moral obligation, especially when it comes to hate speech or any speech that violates our own civil libertarian principles, right? That I feel we as civil libertarians who are defending the right to engage in that speech do have a moral duty to exercise our own free speech rights, to condemn it, to rebut it. But your question, Paul, also raises a strategic question, which I was thinking about during the last wonderful panel as well. And that is that kind of confrontational tactic, the in-your-face counter-protest, effective? And I take my lessons from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has done such wonderful work on monitoring and countering hate groups. And they just issued a memo, a brochure to college students because with the beginning of the new college year and the disturbing rise of recruitment attempts by white supremacists and white nationalists on college campuses, SPLC is advising students who oppose those ideas what is the most effective way to counteract them. And ironically, they say that the most effective form of counter speech is silence, in the sense of just ignore them. Don't cause the controversy. Don't give them the platform and the attention that they are looking for. Have some alternative event, but have it far away, have it be affirmative. And I recently read something, and this was covered in the New York Times in the wake of the Charlottesville violence in Germany, where they have sadly a lot of experience dealing with Nazis. There's one town where one of the Nazi leaders is buried, and Nazi faithful every year. They're not allowed to wear the swastika or the uniform, but they show their fidelity to Hitler and Nazism by having a march to his grave every year. And the anti-Nazis have decided to use humor and mockery in an incredibly effective way. They treat it like an involuntary walkathon. So people in the town and businesses sign up and they pay 10 euros for every, centimeter that these Nazis march. And they're dressed in clown costumes, and at the end they say, thank you, you've raised 10,000 euros, and it goes to an anti-fascist organization. And because it seems that some of the attraction for young men, and I say that with hesitation because I don't like generalizations, but it seems that it is mostly young men that gravitate toward these white nationalist causes, and they're attracted by some sense of, romanticism, and that is burnished by struggling arm-to-arm, armed combat with Antifa. But to be the butt of jokes and people in clown face, throwing a white rice in the air, seems to be a very effective anti-recruitment strategy. So counter speech I use very broadly for any exercise of expression to defeat the ideas, to dissuade people from joining up, to mock, to scorn, to prevent those ideas from becoming public policy.
And so you're saying essentially that those of us who are enraged by this sort of speech give it its power to be enraging speech. We are the ones who create. It's not hate speech if it's just goofball.
That's a very good point. And that the iconic case in the United States is the Skokie case. I'm sure most people have heard about it, but for those who haven't, in 1977, a group of neo-Nazis wanted to march in Skokie, Illinois, a town that had a very large Jewish population at the time, a very high number of which were concentration camp survivors, Holocaust survivors. And the original response of the village, it was technically a village, the village of Skokie, originally, with the support of the mainstream Jewish leaders, was to allow them to march. But there was an upstart group, and because the strategy was always don't amplify their voices by creating controversy. There was insurgents against that, and unfortunately, an effort was made to stop them from speaking, which I say unfortunately because it gave them exactly the propaganda they wanted. The litigation went on for 2 years, all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Predictably, the anti-speech laws were struck down because they violated this core viewpoint neutrality principle. And also predictably, as the Anti-Defamation League said, for every inch of their march, those Nazis got miles of attention.
Yes.
And I read something recently that when they applied for their parade permit, they said that the parade would last for 20 minutes and that they would have 30 marchers, which was probably an exaggeration. So that would have just disappeared in a flash.
Right. Yeah, we had this experience in the early mid-'80s, I guess. There was a neo-Nazi, or I think it was a Klan march, a Ku Klux Klan march in Washington, D.C., and there was about a dozen of them, or 24 of them, that wanted to come and march, and the AntiKlan, which would now be called the Antifa, I suspect, showed up in large numbers, and so the cops said to the Klan, well, violence might ensue. And so the Klan said, well, we don't want violence, so we'll just leave. So they did, just leave without any protest at all. And the AntiKlan were mad that they hadn't had a chance to confront the Klan, so they started confronting the cops, and they flipped over police cars, and the headlines in the Washington Post were, anti-Klan rioters destroy city. It was like, that was successful.
This may be hard. This may be hard for people to believe, but I was still thinking of it this morning when the first panel was referring to Milo. When I was writing my book starting in January, most of the people that I talked to, including well-educated people, yeah, I talked to a few of those, had never even heard of Milo. And what catapulted him to the forefront of everybody's attention was the attempt, and ultimately successful attempt, to shut him down.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the context of Kenyon, because I don't know how familiar you are with the campus. You've done a great job with the colors.
I've had the pleasure of speaking here before, and I have very positive memories.
Outstanding. Minor. But it's only a mile from one end to the other, right? The population of Gambier and Kenyon College is the size of a moderately large suburban high school. Does that change the standard of what we should accept here? Because there's nowhere to go to get away from it. There's nowhere to go. I mean, this is it. Does that suggest that we have to be more careful here about what pollutants we release into the environment, intellectually speaking?
I would say it cuts exactly the opposite way, Paul, that you have to replicate and be sure to nurture within this small cosmos all of the diverse ideas and viewpoints and perspectives that you could find in a larger cosmopolis, right? And students also have to be prepared for life beyond Kenyon. I mean, not everybody, I suppose, stays in Gambier after graduation. And this is a point that Barack Obama was wonderful on this issue. He made it a very big point in the last years of his presidency as we started to see pressure on college campus to censor odious ideas, racist ideas and sexist ideas, but Obama explained why it is especially important for minority students and students who are in relatively disempowered, marginalized groups to hear that speech and to learn to engage and to respond, because he kept saying, I guarantee you when you get out of here for the rest of your life, and he knew what he was talking about, you're going to hear racist, offensive, stupid ideas. And so we are dispreparing you if we shelter you, if we don't help you hone the skills to respond.
But I'm still torn by this because, we talk about this, what kind of actual genuine harm you could be creating through your speech. Do we dismiss the harm to somebody who is being called a name or being described in some horrible way by a speaker who's exercising their freedom of speech?
Absolutely not. And I had a chance to talk with Stanley Fish beforehand. In my book, I acknowledge Stanley and Jeremy Waldron, whom he mentioned, and the other pioneering writers on the harms of hate speech, Richard Delgado, Mari Matsuda, Charles Lawrence. I think they really, this was several decades ago, but really brought to the forefront of consciousness all of us know this from our own experience, no matter who we are, no matter what demographic groups we belong to. Words have hurt us. They've broken our hearts. They've wounded our pride, right? And if you are subject to, if you're a member of a minority group, chances are that you're going to be subject to vilification on that basis. I've been subject to anti-Semitic speech and to misogynistic speech. I know it's probably less than other people have, but I can attest to the fact that words do wound. The question is, what is the effective and appropriate response consistent with individual dignity and empowerment and liberty and democratic self-governance? And I fervently believe, more strongly than I did before doing the research on this book, that even putting aside the principled First Amendment arguments, which are very strong, and I'd love to talk about those, but I'll put those aside for the moment, to talk about the practical policy reasons for not allowing censorship to be the way we address those harms, because the censorship does more harm than good, including for the people who are victimized by the speech. It turns them into victims at worst, passive and helpless and looking to the government to defend and protect them. It's a very paternalistic attitude and stance, a disempowering one. And it also allows the government to pick and choose particular ideas because so many ideas can cause hurt, right? And so in the long run, and this is again a point that was made in the earlier panel that can't be repeated too much, if we entrust to the government the power to shield certain feelings from being hurt, it is going to be the majority in the form of the government that is making those decisions. It is extremely unlikely that that power is going to be used in a way that is beneficial to minorities. So let me give you one example from current events, which is in the wake of the Charlottesville violence, there have been a lot of efforts to pass resolutions by state governments, by the Republican National Committee was having a meeting, they were considering doing it, condemning hate speech. And in a number of states, including even Massachusetts, Black Lives Matter was being considered as a hate group and as an example of hate speech, hateful against police officers, hateful against white people, even been accused of instigating assassinations of police officers. We are awash in evidence about the discrimination, the structural discrimination that is built into our criminal so-called justice system, our civil so-called justice system. We are awash in evidence about the implicit unconscious bias that affects all of us in this culture and society. Why in the world would we entrust to those discriminatory individuals and structures the power to pick and choose which hurtful words will be punished?
I want to open this to questions, but I want just one more thing I want to hit on before we do that. Does the internet change this conversation?
No.
Because, I mean, again, there's a question of whether some of these hate groups, whatever you want to call them, should have access to their websites, basically.
The internet does change it in one profound way that doesn't have to do with the substantive point. So let me answer your substantive question first, Paul. People rightly say that the internet makes it so much easier to engage in hate speech, to distribute it. It also makes counter speech much easier and more effective, and it makes it easier to monitor what kinds of counter speech strategies are effective. And to their credit, Twitter and Facebook, among others, have funded some studies by academics looking into effective counter speech strategies, and I am so encouraged. So they talk about, interestingly enough, what is least useful is condemning somebody. Oh, you're a hater. You're engaging in hate speech. Yes, you can condemn the idea, but you have to engage the person in a compassionate and humorous vein. And there are remarkable success stories of engaging with people who go online to propagate hateful views who are then interceded with. And by the way, this is true even in the offline world. There are many organizations that include mostly people who were formerly members of hate groups who have seen the light and are making it their responsibility to help unrecruit others from those groups. Now, the way that the internet does change things is that, as many people do not know, private sector actors, including those who run the major online intermediaries, including social media, are not subject to the First Amendment. The First Amendment only constrains government. So you have Facebook and all of these others with their own undisclosed, non-transparent hate speech codes that are not subject to any kind of accountability. And it is really frightening how they are using it, but completely predictable. The kinds of subjective discretion that you get that at best is, because going back to your very first question, at best with such a nebulous concept, there's going to be arbitrariness in deciding what is hate and what is not. At worst, it's going to be discriminatory against people or groups or ideas that are disfavored. And we can see that with, I'll use Facebook as an example, because for several years now, a coalition of almost 80 civil rights organizations, including the ACLU, have been complaining to Facebook that it is enforcing its hate speech code in a way that allows threats and disparaging statements against people of color to be there, and but censors as hate speech about complaining about official misconduct, including police violence against civilians. So it is something that you would predict in any hate speech code, but we don't have the First Amendment remedy or an equal protection remedy or a due process remedy that we would have if it were the government doing it.
That's fascinating.
It's frightening.
Yes, frightening. Okay, well, we will field hate-filled questions from the audience if there are any. Go ahead here. Oh, wait, he's going to bring you a microphone, so shout into that.
Hello?
Hi.
Hi. So to me, it seems that for free speech to be effective and foster our democracy, thoughtful listening is also a requirement. And today I see fewer and fewer dialogues occurring and more monologues bumping into each other and sometimes violently slamming into each other in public spheres, both in person and online. So speaking from your legal background, how do we get people to listen to each other?
That's such a great question. And I had a similar dialogue with Nancy Powers, one of your faculty members. And we were asking, how do you get students to come hear people that they think they're going to disagree with, and some students voicing the opinion that, why should I waste my time hearing an idea I disagree with? So one thing that I do in my personal experience is try to do few solo talks and instead have a debate or a discussion. So then you can get people coming in, and maybe they'll come in because they're rooting for your opponent. I prefer discussion to debate, but actually to attract an audience sometimes it's better to style it as a debate. Other than that, I think you have to persuade people that explain what is the positive about hearing an idea they disagree with. And we do this, I'm a law professor. This is in the DNA of law schools in a way that I hadn't really realized until this summer. Heather Gerken became the first female dean of the Yale Law School, and she wrote this wonderful op-ed for the Time Magazine Online, in which she pointed out that of all the free speech conflagrations that we've had around the country, not a single one has been at a law school. And she said the reason for that is in law school, it's just built into the education that you are exposed to all arguments on every issue. As I say to my students, their responsibility is to learn to articulate every plausible perspective on every issue. And I think that would be a great mantra for liberal arts education as well.
And I will mention, by the way, that I get a lot of hate speech in my inbox. You know, I'm despicable, I'm fake news, I'm a liar, whatever else. Half of it's true. But I have made friends with a lot of these folks by just engaging it. Because they will send me an email saying, you're a lying, despicable bastard, whatever, and your story was full of falsehoods, and I'll reply, and I'll say, actually, what part of the story was false? And then they'll say, well, but over a period of, assuming they're not just drunk, which sometimes happens, no, I mean, really, I mean, if you're just drunk, there's no point having the conversation. But assuming, once they realize that I am a person, not the fake news, despicable fake news, but I'm actually a human being who makes decisions based on, you know, whatever else, they start to having a very engaged conversation about why they disagree with me, why they think, wouldn't it be nice if you did the opposing story, the other side? Sometimes I do. That kind of stuff. It can be actually pretty fruitful.
You just gave me a wonderful insight. Thank you. So everybody's probably heard of the Gordon Allports' famous contact theory from the early 1950s. And it's such common sense, but it's wonderful to have social science validated, which has been validated over and over again, which is the strongest way to overcome discrimination or prejudice against any kind of group is to have contact with people in that group. And it even extends to media depictions, interestingly enough. So to have something like, a TV show that features what had been a minority group, people feel as if they know that person, and they start thinking of them as individuals rather than as members of the group. So you're just extending that to not only people who look differently, but to people who think differently.
Another question from students back here. We got one back in the back.
So it seems to me there's a bit of a contradiction on the best way to oppose hate speech, or what's considered to be hate speech, by college students on campuses who think that ideas that they loathe, need to be combated. So the idea of, say, a white nationalist group coming to campus and organizing an event far away and ignoring them, would you say that that's them using their free speech, but in a different way, in a more productive way than approaching them directly? Because there are a lot of students that would make the argument that if they do actually attempt to talk to these people who they consider hateful, these people who they consider to, basically undermine their common humanity. These are people who don't believe that they are created equal. Is it the best function of their free speech to ignore, but perhaps not, mark it to the students as ignoring? Say that, you actually are utilizing your free speech, but by ignoring them, by having maybe a more positive demonstration somewhere far away, you are reaffirming the humanity of these students that's being questioned by such
an
groups.
excellent question, and you give me an opportunity to elaborate on. There were many recommendations. I urge you to take a look at their publication, which you can easily find online. So they suggest a range of actions, and I use counter speech to mean anything but violence or censorship, right? And the first is to go to the student group that has invited these speakers on campus and try to persuade them not to do it. They have a right to do it, but just the fact that you have a right to do something doesn't mean that it's right. And this goes back to the points that we were just talking about. Maybe engaging with them, letting them understand the pain and the harm that it would do. That might work. So that's the first thing you do. And another suggestion they make is to meet with student groups who are likely to be the targets of the hate speech, to have mutual support, to show that they are affirmatively included in campus. And then certainly try to engage with those who are members of these groups. They are susceptible to being weaned away, but not to do it in a theatrical, confrontational way. And I do have to say, the examples that I read about people being recruited away, it takes a lot of patience and a lot of conversations, and you have to invest a lot of time in it. It's not the quick and dirty, punch a Nazi or hold a banner.
And I will say, for what it's worth, that, say what you will about what went on in Charlottesville, particularly, and some people are critical of President Trump for empowering this kind of speech. But it has inspired some very, very broad conversation across this country about views that are probably much more widely held than we thought they were, and what we as a society think about those views. To some degree, I consider this a pretty healthy opportunity for learning about democracy and our expression in democratic culture.
And there really has been an improvement in our society in that respect. I mean, despite, believe me, I'm completely aware of the entrenched racism in the criminal justice system and so forth, as I said earlier. But what struck me when I went back to read these articles from several decades ago that first talked about the hurt of words, they complained at least as much about the silence from the rest of society. First of all, that the media was not covering hate crimes. Secondly, if they did cover them, they were covering them as isolated incidents, not as part of a general pattern. And third, that government officials and campus officials and the community was not speaking out to condemn the haters. I was shocked because things have changed so much since then. So Mari Matsuda said, for example, that when racist incidents occurred on campus, that the deafening silence of campus officials and the campus community was like re-aggravating the wound because it conveyed an implicit approval of the hateful speech. Now it's the opposite. I mean, it's somebody said if a politician or a journalist says anything, even potentially insensitive, they're at least called upon to be fired, as happened with Bill Maher recently, and in many cases they actually lose their jobs. So I think that's been a very positive improvement, and as always I note improvement, not so we can pat ourselves on our back and rest on our laurels, but be encouraged to keep on the good fight. And this is why, interestingly enough, a lot of the European countries now, you have many human rights activists and lawyers saying we should move more in the American direction because they perceive that we have made more progress through civil society than through government repression. Germany has the strongest anti-hate speech laws, Germany and France, and look what's happened there. We had a right-wing racist party attain almost 13% of the vote. We have vicious, violent crime on the basis of race baiting and ethnic discrimination in Germany, despite the existence of hate speech laws.
Yeah, reminder, you can spray pesticide, doesn't mean the bugs go away, right? I think we have time for one more, approximately. If there's another question in the back.
I have a question.
There.
You kind of touched on it in a minute, but is the ACLU, I thought one of the most potent strategies that I saw on Facebook for the alt-right gatherers was that people were outing them to their employers. Has the ACLU ever been have to get involved, and the employers were firing them for carrying tiki torches in Charlottesville? So would the ACLU would that be a challenge for private employers? Have you ever had to defend, has the ACLU ever had to defend any of these people? Is that something I, as a private employer, could not have any problem with as far as letting someone go for their views expressed at Charlottesville?
That's an excellent question. I don't know factually whether we've had any such cases of that exact sort, but I can tell you this, that the ACLU is not the American constitutional law union. We defend civil liberties through, which we consider to include freedom of speech. And in some incidents, we can use the Constitution as a tool to do so. But in other cases, we have to use other sources of law. We believe that people should not have to give up their free speech rights as the price of getting a job. And so we have argued that employers should not be allowed to fire people because of expression that occurs off the job that does not interfere with their performance. You can only do that as a source of law, I mean, if you have an anti-discrimination statute. But in principle, we would say you should not have to forfeit your right to go demonstrate for Black Lives Matter or the alt-right if it does not interfere with your job.
Except for reporters, by the way. I mean, really, as reporters,
You're not even allowed to belong to organizations,
we have basically
right?
no free speech rights, and we choose not to. Like, I mean, I don't vote, I don't donate, I don't give money to anybody, I don't join organizations. There's a very interesting moment with the Women's March that happened in January in Washington, D.C. It was a big event. You might have heard about it. We sent a memo around the newsroom saying two things. One, if you are covering the event for news purposes for USA Today or our affiliates, wear something clearly indicating that you are press. because you may be in a photograph and people are going to say, oh, see, you guys are in favor of the, and then you lose your credibility. The second thing we said is that if you are not covering the event for news purposes, stay away from the event. And that is just sort of the deal we make, because as reporters and as news organizations, we are trying to preserve a promise to our customers, our readers, of objectivity and fairness. We ask our reporters to maintain that in their personal lives and to not choose sides. On that note, I think we can resolve. Thank you very much for this civil discussion.